So nice to see so many friends and colleagues. My name is Daniela Ozacky and I am honored to open this virtual conference organized by us at the Holocaust Studies program at Western Galilee College in Akko, Israel. First of all, I regret to tell you that Professor Thomas Weber will not be joining us today due to a heavy loss in his family. And I believe I speak on everyone's behalf, sending Tom our deepest condolences. But thanks all of you for being with us today at the Zoom, which became the new normal in academic conferences. For a long time, we've been developing the idea of holding an entire event on the intriguing topic, Rethinking Hitler 80 years later. Today's date, January 20, is exactly 80 years to the Wannsee conference, and this is not a coincidence. And I would like to share my screen now, and please tell me if you can see it.
Yeah.
You can see it, right? Okay, so for many years, numerous historians, psychologists, sociologists, authors, philosophers, and ordinary people have tried to find a solution to the riddle, who was Adolf Hitler? And how did he become the Hitler we all know? To this day, we have no clear-cut answers. He was born on April 20, 1889, in the beautiful Austrian town of Braunau am Inn. And you can see some photos of him when he was a baby and a little boy. His father, Alois, hoped he would follow his steps and become a civil servant. But Adolf's dream was to study art, to be an artist. Young Hitler found in himself a great artistic talent. However, after not being accepted to the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and simultaneously losing his mother to cancer, his future was unclear. He felt lonely and abandoned and decided to move to Vienna. Apparently, these years of his early 20s, in which he lived in poverty and distress, shaped his character. And as he wrote, during this period, my eyes were open to see two dangers whose names I had hardly known before: Marxism and Judaism. He claimed that during those years, his worldview had been shaped. Hitler enlisted to the army and fought in World War I. You can see him here as a soldier. But the question remains, how did this simple, shy, mediocre person who wished to become an artist turned into being the Führer, the leader of Nazi Germany, who had left behind over 50 million dead and a horrible destruction all over Europe? This contrast between the anonymity at the beginning of Hitler's path and his rise to the status of a powerful leader, almost a god, is inconceivable. And I would like to conclude this very short introduction by quoting one of Hitler's victims, a Jewish woman from a small town in Belarus who lost her entire family, including a husband and two children. She managed to escape to the forests and join the partisans. And in her testimony, she said years later, "We Jews, despite being educated, didn't understand the situation. We didn't understand that the war would go on for a few years. We wanted to live and hoped for miracles. We waited every day for Hitler's downfall. If we did not illusion ourselves in false hopes, perhaps many more of us would have survived. And some technical notes. We are recording the sessions and would upload it to our website, and please keep your microphones on mute. As always, I want to thank Dr. Yaron Pasher, Dr. Boaz Cohen, head of the program, and the organizing team. And thank you all. Yaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniela, very much for this wonderful introduction. Haunting, I'd say, as well. We made this a custom in these war and Holocaust events to give the first words to a real general. And we are delighted to have with us today General Cohen. Dr. Bill Cohen is a retired Major General in the U.S. Air Force and Professor of Business Administration. General Cohen entered the Air Force in 1959 as a graduate of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He is a master navigator and has flown more than 3,500 hours in bombardment, attack, and transport aircraft. As an Air Force lieutenant, he was assigned as a navigator on a B-52 nuclear bomber trained to be fully prepared for nuclear warfare if the U.S. was attacked. He flew 174 combat missions in an A-26 attack aircraft in the Vietnam War and additional combat missions in the Middle East during the Yom Kippur War as a member of the Israeli Air Force. As a registered professional engineer with patents in the US, the UK, and Israel, he was recognized by the Israeli government for his contributions to the development of Israel's first fighter. General Cohen earned a PhD in executive management from Claremont Graduate University and was the first PhD student of the late Peter Drucker, widely known as the father of modern management and the art of leadership. His academic leader roles have included president of 2 private universities and department chairman and institute director at a public university. Among his over 50 books translated into 23 languages and over 100 articles resulting from his research are the bestsellers The Stuff of Heroes and The New Art of Leader. General Cohen is presented on 4 continents, and executives from more than 50 countries have heard him speak. He also received an honorary doctorate in human letters from the International Academy for Integration of Science and Business in Moscow, in which former President Gorbachev is a member of the same academy. General Cohen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Yaron. Yaron is also my editor for an articles I write, and it's in several countries, and including Israel. And Israel, he's the editor. So thank you very much. And I guess we can switch now to I have prepared some overheads. I am very honored to be asked to do this for several reasons. I think you're doing something really unique here that has not been thoroughly explored before. That is the Holocaust and especially Hitler's leadership. And what I would like to do in opening is your conference is to rethink Hitler along the lines of Drucker. That is his view of leadership and how it caused and how Hitler made major errors, which I think caused the loss of World War II for Germany. So without further ado, I guess I should at least point out, in honor of Daniela, I'm wearing a Haifa tie today, which was presented to me by the eventual Hamfaked Helayom, Admiral Ben Bashat. We use Admiral outside of Israel. Okay, Danielle, I guess we can, or who's running the overheads? Yaron, are you doing the overheads?
Yes, it's already on. You can start speaking and let me know when to change the slide.
Okay. Well, I'm speaking now. What are you talking about?
Not open.
Go ahead.
You have to open up the slides.
I have to open it?
No, you
Not
can't
full
see it,
screen.
right? Okay, wait a minute, let me try it again. I think that now it will be okay. Can you see it? Great.
I
Yeah.
can see it at any rate. Okay, I guess we can go to slide number 2. I think an introduction is necessary in the case of Peter Drucker in Israel. I mean, ethnically, he was Jewish, but he was raised as a Christian. Peter was, his father converted to Christianity. He was an official in the Austrian civil service. And I do not know, I don't know what the reason was, but one can speculate that was the reason that he converted. In any case, he didn't waste time when Hitler became chancellor in Germany in 1933, or he left for England right away. And then 4 years later, he immigrated to the United States. In addition to 40 books, he wrote a major academic paper in 1936, which was published in German, The Jewish Question in Germany, and it was banned by the Nazis. In the first page, he stated that he was a German citizen of Jewish descent, and he refuted Nazi theory as being neither accurate nor beneficial for Germany's development. He considered himself at that point in life a German, I believe. He did not advertise his Jewishness in class. One can see that, both visually as with his characteristics and the name. And I was amazed when I was a PhD student that he knew so much about Judaism. I thought this guy's got to be Jewish, but he never announced that. And it wasn't until after his death, and I read his wife's book called Invent Radium, or I'll Pull Your Hair, which is something her mother told her. She was supposed to become the secretary of someone famous and wealthy and famous and do something really great like invent radium. And she said, if you don't do that, I'm going to pull your hair. So that's where the title of the book came from. But in the book, on her first page, she says that my parents were non-practicing Jews, Reformed Jews. And so I thought, well, Peter had to be Jewish. And I gave a presentation. I was invited to give a presentation at his university, and after his death, and I was introduced as General Cohen. Usually I use my military title for military organizations only, and use my PhD title elsewhere in academia. And his wife, after the presentation came up, she says, Bill, we've known each other for years, but until he introduced you as a general, I didn't realize who you were. She said, Peter used to talk about you all the time, and he even said, she said, he was your you were his favorite student, of which I really felt something about. And but at any rate, he was Jewish. Ethnically, he was Jewish. And worldwide, he's known as the father of modern management, or sometimes a man who invented management. And I write a monthly article about Peter's views on various subjects. And Yaron, as a matter of fact, Dr. Pasher is my editor in Israel, and that's published once a month. Okay, could you have the next slide, please, Daniela? He was unique, I think, among most management scholars. I mean, he was the only management scholar that I've identified that maintained that a successful leader must, and I emphasize the word must, have integrity and must also demonstrate social responsibility. Now, many leader gurus, professors, and everyone else writes that a good leader should have these traits, but he said a leader must have them. And I found that interesting, and it really distinguished him from other management scholars. Next slide, please, Daniela. These are the basic traits, according to Drucker: integrity, positive interactions with others, social responsibility, which I define as positive interactions with the groups, and performance. Those are the basic traits of a good leader. According, they're not so different, but again, the integrity and the social responsibility, he said, a leader must have. Okay, next one, please, Daniela. Now, the question I would like to pose to you as you open your conference is, did Hitler's leadership failures ensure Germany would lose World War II? The invasion of Russia, completely unnecessary. Stalin thought he had a firm deal with Hitler, and he had no plans for attacking Germany, nor joining the Allies. And he was not afraid of Hitler because Stalin was not afraid of Hitler because he felt that since Hitler was already at war, Germany was already at war with England, that he would not enter a war with Russia for that reason. He would not invade the Soviet Union. And so he wasn't worried about it. He was really shocked by Operation Barbarossa when Germany, in fact, invaded. But the invasion was unnecessary. I mean, Stalin was not thinking about war with. He knew that maybe eventually they would have war with Germany, but it would be for at least another several years because of the war with England. Also, he declared war against the US when his ally Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. What did Germany gain by this? Nothing, but it acquired a strong enemy, even while the leading Japanese naval commander, Admiral Yamamoto, feared that Japan had simply awakened a sleeping giant, as he phrased it, for little permanent gain. And in fact, there's no permanent gain. So that was a dumb thing to do. He refused to coordinate German strategy with his main allies, Japan and Italy, throughout the war. Now, there was all kinds of joint conferences you can find where Churchill and Roosevelt, and Stalin himself attended, and they planned strategy. And I know that you're familiar with some of the Churchill, for example, or Stalin wanted very much to have the D-Day landing in 1942, 1943, wanted to have as much as soon as possible, take the pressure off of Russia. But in this case here, Hitler refused to coordinate anything. He had, I don't know what he much have been thinking of, but he probably felt he didn't think too much of Italian the Italian military as a strategic force, but he felt, okay, let them do what they want. But he also felt the same about the Japanese. Let them do what they want, and we'll do what we want, and we'll just let each other know what happens. So that was not the brightest thing in the world. He refused to coordinate and did not coordinate Germany's strategy with any of his allies. The big one, the really big one, I think, however, was the Holocaust itself. Now, yes, I know about his deep anti-Semitic beliefs and everything else, but by initiating the Holocaust, he lost the manpower and brain power. I mean, Einstein, for example, escaped the US, and he and other nuclear scientists convinced Roosevelt to embark on the development of an atomic bomb, which, while not used against Germany, as it turned out, because the bomb wasn't ready until at the very end of the war, after Germany had been defeated. But still, this is a major issue. Also, before the war, most German Jews were loyal to Germany, despite the severe anti-Semitism. For example, and maybe as proof of this, an estimated 20,000 Jews served voluntarily in the German armed forces during World War II, including at the highest ranks. And as an example, Milch was vice commander only to Hermann Goering in the Luftwaffe. An amazing, and he was Jewish. Now, he had himself declared a bastard, and Hitler had approved every single Jew that served. But, there was an author recently in England, I believe, that wrote an entire book about Hitler's Jewish soldiers. But they were loyal. They felt them just like Drucker in a sense, because Drucker wrote his book, The Jewish Question in Germany in 1937. And he wrote that, that declared himself of Jewish descent, but a German citizen. So that came first. Or another example is Ludendorff, who was a supporter of Hitler and a vicious anti-Semite, by the way. But if you go back, he got his fame because he was chief of staff to von Hindenburg in World War I. And they succeeded and won the Battle of Tannenberg, which was a major victory early in the war, 1914. And he wrote a strong letter in the captured territories in Russia that they had entered to the Jews. There were a number of Jews here, and it was addressed, "My dear Jews," and he went on to say words to the effect that you've been held back for years under the Tsar, but now Germany is in control when the time of freedom, and so forth and so forth. Now, did he mean it? Probably not. I mean, but he wasn't sincere. He was an anti-Semite, but still, that's what he said. So the Holocaust diverted scarce resources from the war effort to persecute and kill Jews. So for these reasons, I think Hitler's own failures of leadership by Drucker's standards ensured loss of World War II. Next slide, Daniela. This is just, if you wish to ask me further questions by email, you can do that at wcohenstuffofheroes.com. I don't know whether you want to call me on telephone or not, but you're certainly welcome to do that. And also, this shows you when I'm young and handsome over here on the one picture with Alexei Lanov, who was on the command of the Soyuz side of the International Space Station, along with American people. And then on the right with Arnold Schwarzenegger in his movie Two Lies. They needed a general, and so the Air Force volunteered me. So at any rate, I'm honored to initiate your conference, and I wish you good fortune with it. I know that with the quality of the folks that you have, I know that you will do well, and thank you for allowing me to participate. Thank you, Daniela. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Yaron, for asking me to do this.
Thank you very much, General Cohen, for this wonderful introduction, thought-provoking words and ideas. Daniela, please proceed.
Thank you, and I see that the chat is already full of your comments, so great. Please, you can write your questions and comments on the chat. So now I am honored to introduce to you Professor Winfried Heinemann, whom I met years back on a live conference in Chateau de Vincennes in Paris. Professor Winfried Heinemann is a retired military officer and a professor at the Brandenburg Technical University, as well as being an honorary researcher with Lancaster University's Center for War and Diplomacy. He specializes in the history of the military resistance against Hitler and contributed to the debate about the resistance and war crimes on the Eastern Front since the late 1990s. He published a monograph just recently in 2022, Operation Valkyrie, a military history of the 20 July 1944 plot. He was the director of historical education and deputy commanding officer at the Military History Research Office in Freiburg, in Breisgau, and Potsdam, and was awarded the Daedalus Cohen German Academic Scholarship Foundation in 2019. He is also the review editor of the International Journal of Military History and Historiography, which is a great journal. And Professor Heinemann is going to present about military resistance against Hitler, the war, and genocide. The floor is yours.
Well, good evening to everybody, and Daniela, thanks for inviting me, and thanks for the kind words. All I have to do now is live up to them. Okay, that the National Conservative resistance against Hitler should have had some outdated political concepts is not exactly new. In two much quoted papers, Hermann Gramel and Hans Mommsen made that plain about 50 years ago. At the time, that caused quite some consternation and protest. Would people have to rewrite the history of what had until then passed as the conscience in revolt, and what had often been presented as the forerunner of the Bonn Republic? And that article by Hans Mommsen wasn't even as bad as it could have been. Hans Mommsen admitted much later that he had knowingly left out the question of the resistance and its attitude to the Jews and the genocide, as he felt it was too sensitive back in 1966. The question was only really posed by Christoph Dipper in 1983-84, that is, after the Holocaust TV series, it sensitized many West Germans to the history of anti-Semitic genocide. But all those focused largely on the civilians, the diplomats, the politicians, the bureaucrats among the conspirators. The question of whether members of the military resistance had been involved in war crimes on the Eastern Front after 1941, or actually after 1939, was raised first by an article in the book accompanying the Wehrmachtausstellung. This triggered a lengthy debate. I'll summarize that in a moment. But even then, the debate remained narrowly focused on war crimes, first in the Soviet Union, later in other theaters as well, but never really interpreting the military resistance both as an integral part of the overall national conservative opposition. It was always kind of treated as, well, they were the military arm of the civilian conspiracy, nor did it interpret military resistance as an integral part of German military history in general. And I'll try to do that a little bit and see what comes of it. Before we do that, I would like to draw your attention to the concept of polycratic structures that historians like Hans Mommsen and Sir Ian Kershaw introduced into the debate about the Third Reich. They showed how rivalries among the political administrative bureaucracy of the Nazi regime actually hampered the overall war effort and the system's efficiency. What I would like to do is to show how the same goes for the military as well. Because not only did Army, Navy, and Luftwaffe permanently compete with one another for political influence, for manpower, for material resources, all three, again, were in competition with the Waffen-SS, although that, of course, affected mostly the Army, because there was no air Waffen-SS or naval Waffen-SS, and all those against the party apparatus. Don't forget that one. We're coming here to a weakness in the leadership system, and I'm picking up a little bit what General Cohen hinted at in his presentation. The armaments industry was a characteristically mixed organization combining private enterprise with state directives. Speer, Todt, Saukel all had a say in manpower procurement, and Generaloberst Fromm's replacement army was the representative of all three branches of the Wehrmacht, trying to procure their share. When Stauffenberg actually placed his bomb under Hitler's map table, he was supposed to brief the Führer about the manpower needed to raise more infantry divisions. To anyone trained in logical thinking, and I'm coming back to General Cohen's paper again, the absurdity of the Reich's complicated and counterproductive command structure was patently obvious. It was all a big mess. There was a young major in 41-42 assigned to the General Staff's organizational department who would occasionally lecture about this. And he would usually start by claiming, and I quote, "The German command structure was even more absurd than what the most qualified General Staff officers could have produced if they had been asked to invent the most absurd command structure possible." The young man's name was Klaus Graf Stauffenberg. And this had taken Germany into a war which it could not win. It hampered the war effort, it cost unnecessary lives, and for many General Staff officers, this was a major reason for them to take action against Hitler. So now let me come back to the question of the war crimes and the resistance. As I said, about 20 years ago, the debate opened up, and it meant largely the implication of conspirators in Army Group Center in the crimes perpetrated during the German attack on the Soviet Union after the summer of 1941. This has been discussed a long time, and I'd say the consolidated state of the art has emerged there. Men such as Colonel Henning von Treschow, the Army Group's chief operations officer, knew about the mass executions, but were not personally implicated. And they would regularly mention the monstrosity of the crimes as a reason for their attempt to overthrow the regime. Ulrich von Schwerin was actually, when facing the People's Court that had him hanged the same day, said, "I was thinking of the many murders" when asked what his motive was. And that went for many of them. But for some of them, there was also a military political dimension to these monstrosities. For them, the essential question was, how could war be brought to an end? And here we come back to what Thomas Weber might have enlightened us more about, Hitler's characteristics. Hitler never defined any war aims which we could interpret as a desired end state, as we would say in US security policy parlance this day and age. Poland, Denmark, Norway, France, the Benelux countries, Yugoslavia, Greece, they had all been occupied, but never in his life did Hitler ever conclude a peace treaty. Hitler was constitutionally unable to make peace. For Hitler, the war would go on and on and on. And if there was to be a peace, the many crimes committed by Germans would also ensure that nobody would want to make peace with Germany either. Helmut Stief, one of the conspirators, wrote to his wife, "He made us all into accomplices." All of Germany had been made accomplices to worldwide genocide. And that made any peace with this government impossible. For Russia, I would like to bring up an idea that has not been fully debated yet. I'm sort of throwing out to you as well to test the waters. Many conservative officers, many national conservatives in general, had a romantic notion of old Russia, or had been even involved in the secret armaments cooperation with the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Quite a few came from families who had roots in the Tsarist Empire. Stauffenberg's own mother came from the Baltic nobility. So for those, an anti-Bolshevik war was perfectly okay. And seeing that they truly believed many of the Bolsheviks were Jews, they saw the mass executions of Jewish men as part of the regrettable necessities of war. In fact, one of the survivors, Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, stated to Munich court even in 1959, and I quote, "At the time, one might readily have believed that the executions were due to the war. This applies even more as my personal experience showed that among the agents there were many Jews, and that among the Jewish population, crime was more widespread and more active than among the rest of the Russian population." I repeat, this is 1959, believe it or not. Yet, once these national conservatives began to realize that men, women, and children were being slaughtered alike. Once they understood that this was not about liberating Ukrainians or Russians from the Bolshevik yoke, but that this was about decimating Jews, Slavs, and others, to turn them into serfs and eventually eliminate them all, that's when these officers realized that this was not the war they had set out to fight. A war whose aim was the ethnic cleansing of Eastern Europe, that was something that was not their thing. And also they knew that was something they knew Germany did not have the resources to win. For them, this was both a crime against the subjugated populations and against the German nation at the same time. And you can see this in Army Group Center. You can actually pinpoint it to a date. It is not so much the Einsatzgruppe Bravo under Arthur Neber, who was actually, on the one hand, responsible for the murder of 50 to 60,000 Jews, but was also hanged for his role in the conspiracy. No, there was, on 20 October 1941, a massacre perpetrated by SS units not part of the Einsatzgruppe, which was witnessed by officers from the High Command of Army Group Center and in a small place called Borisov, Belarus. And that, for many of the conspirators, marked the shift in their understanding of the war from allegedly legitimate combat against male able-bodied Jews to genocidal war against all Jews under German control. And that explains also why some conspirators, higher ranking conspirators, were in fact also involved in some of the criminal orders given. Let me just quote one. Generaloberst Erich Höppner, who had been designated to be on the 20th of July, the new commander-in-chief of the replacement army, told his Panzer Group on their way into Russia, and I quote, "This struggle must have as its aim the destruction of today's Russia and must be therefore conducted with unheard of harshness. In particular, there can be no quarters given to the bearers of today's Russian Bolshevist system." But the key word, I think, in this is twice the word today's Russia, meaning he differentiates between today's Bolshevist Russia, which in his understanding is also largely Jewish, and the true Russia of national conservative dreams of the 1920s. So let's face it, officers in the conspiracy that had formed among the staff of Army Group Center and that in March 1943 undertook at least one, if not two, attempts on Hitler's life, were also inextricably involved in the war of extermination. If Gersdorff claimed after the war that the word Jew had never been mentioned at the headquarters, that is patently and demonstrably untrue. The Bundeswehr still has a barracks named after Gersdorff. He was involved in the conspiracy, all right, but he is a highly, highly problematic character. Let me add to this something else. The Group Center never stopped protesting, claiming they didn't know what to do with those Jews, claiming that those trains should be used to bring up ammunition and food for the army rather than more Jews. For them, this was also, and General Cohen again alleged to that already, that was interfering with the needs of conventional warfare as they thought they were fighting. And when all those pleas to stop sending those trains went unheard, that is when they understood that the real aim of this war was not the conventional war aim, but the real aim of this war was the genocidal transformation of Eastern Europe. And that made this war a crime, both against the people murdered by Germans and against the German nation in the long term. And the German nation was, of course, what was so close to their hearts. So the war was, in some ways, a motive for resistance. Because let's face it, the military conspirators we're talking about here, from Beck through Treschow, Stauffenberg, and all the others, were no pacifists. For them, waging war as such was nothing immoral. There's a question here.
But I think we
I'll
will
do that later. I'll do that later. Okay.
Okay.
What was immoral in their eyes was a war which threatened the existence of the German nation, and that starts even earlier. For example, Beck resigned after protesting against Hitler's plans to attack Czechoslovakia, not for any legal or moral reasons, that's not the point, but Beck was convinced that Hitler's war plans would lead into a war which would annihilate Germany. Finis Germaniae is the reason he gave. Similarly, Colonel Oster had been convinced a campaign against France in the spring of 1940 would be Germany's undoing, and that's why he informed the Dutch military attaché of the attack date. There is an element of nationalism in this. And this episode also serves to dispel the myth that it was only the impending military catastrophe which moved national conservative officers to act, as has been claimed so often. There are not many, but there are a few conspirators who remain faithful to the cause of getting rid of the Nazi regime from 1938 at the latest through 1944. All those had been trained to think along Clausewitzian lines. A war must be fought with a peace in mind, and that peace after the war must be preferable to what you could achieve without war. So conducting a war which could not lead to a good peace was anathema to them, and that is exactly what they saw here. Stauffenberg had been trained to think in terms of strategic logistics. He told a close friend, Joachim Kuhn, that, and I quote, "From the moment when we made the mistake of attacking Russia, Germany was unable to sustain the war effort, both regarding manpower and material resources. From the moment we made the mistake of attacking Russia, not 1943, 1944. No, from the very moment on." This is not moral reasoning. This is a purely technical reasoning. And of course, what contributed was also the amateurish, badly organized way in which Hitler conducted this war, bringing us back to General Cohen's presentation. And that was why Hitler and the regime would have to go. Let me take a look also at a connection that is not that often seen in the literature, namely the war as a factor that conditions resistance activities. The idea of the Putsch organization was to overthrow the entire Nazi regime. And this is what distinguishes this from all other attempts on Hitler's life. Georg Elser, for example, meant to kill Hitler, but had no other program after that. Maurice Bavot, the Swiss Catholic, same thing. Here, what we have is a well thought out and well planned coup d'etat aiming to overthrow the entire regime. And that was getting more and more difficult as the war went on, because Hitler and his cronies held more or increasingly strong assets within the Reich. Himmler, as Minister of the Interior, controlled general administration and police. Bormann and Goebbels controlled the party. Goering controlled what was left of the Luftwaffe inside the Reich. And this was changing. The balance was tilting increasingly against the army, against an army which Hitler and Goebbels in particular had already begun to perceive as reactionary anyway. That's why Hitler, for example, tasked Himmler with educating the Volksgrenadier divisions, which Stauffenberg and Fromm had just begun to raise. And with Fromm coming under scathing criticism, especially from Goebbels, the day was drawing near when Himmler would take over command of the replacement army, leaving Himmler, in fact, in control of the last sizable power factor within the Reich's border. That put Stauffenberg and his group under enormous pressure to act, and it combined with other factors. Julius Leber, Stauffenberg's Social Democrat ally, had been arrested and would begin to talk any day. A warrant was out for Karl Gördler, who was garrulous and civilian head of the conspiracy. Also, as far as the foreign policy of the conspiracy went, Stauffenberg had hoped to be able to negotiate with the Western allies from a position of at least relative strength, preferably before the planned invasion or possibly after it had failed. Now, however, Stauffenberg's cousin Cäsar von Hofacker brought the news from the horse's mouth from Field Marshal Rommel himself that the Normandy front would not hold another 2 weeks. In the east, co-conspirator General Henning von Tresckow, Chief of Staff, Second Army, was in the ideal position to predict the impending collapse of Army Group Center, Germany's greatest military defeat in the Second World War. So to sum this up, Germany's military and diplomatic position was crumbling. The opposition's forces were gradually weakening vis-à-vis the party and the SS, and the conspiracy might be uncovered by the Gestapo at any moment. The conditions of war were such that no time was to be lost if the uprising was still to make any sense. Now I have 10 minutes left and I'll try to remain within that. I would like to say a few words about how you organize a coup d'etat under the conditions of war and the Nazi regime. And actually, if I had decided to do a few slides, now I would bring up a map with blue and red arrows to show how this actually made sense in the terms of a military operation. The basic problem was that in 1938, plans had been to send one infantry division from Potsdam, whose commander was privy to the conspiracy, into Berlin, arrest whoever needed to be arrested, and that would be it. The idea being that if the divisional commander and the regimental commanders ordered the regiments to march, they would march. By 1944, Stauffenberg, who was very much a realist, knew that that would not happen. As long as Hitler was alive, no way would the army march against him. So any planning had to have two elements. First, to kill Hitler in order to make an uprising possible, and secondly, the uprising itself. Now, in 1938, the idea had been, we have one unit and we know the commander, and the commander is reliable, so we're going to set that division. The planning had still been the same until about 42, 43. We have plans for October 43 for East Prussia, and there again, a specific division that is just being created in East Prussia is detailed to occupy the various command posts in East Prussia. But of course, as units move in and out of the Reich, this becomes increasingly difficult. This is a highly problematic approach. So the idea comes up to make use of plans that are at first sight perfectly legitimate, and that is what is now known as Operation Valkyrie. The idea, what do we do if the Soviet prisoners of war, the German communists, maybe reinforced by Soviet airborne landings, forced laborers, etc., rise up in an armed coup? We need to deploy the army to suppress that. That is what Valkyrie is about on the surface. And this is being hijacked by the conspiracy. And it devolves responsibility for organizing troops on a day-to-day basis to the military districts, who have to report every week what forces they can make available in case this is required. So rather than depend on specific elements, you hijack a structure that makes those elements available that are there at a given moment. However, it means that the replacement army has to be brought into this. And the only one who can do that is Stauffenberg, because he is the chief of staff and deputy commander of the replacement army, and the commander from is not reliable. So Stauffenberg eventually ends up being the only conspirator who both has access to Hitler and is willing to do it. And that means that Stauffenberg has to perform both roles, assassin and supervising the uprising. And that hampers the thing from the very beginning. Now you can discuss till the cows come home whether a different assassin would have been better, and I'd agree with you, anyone else would probably have been better. But let's face it, this is a very, very small group of conspirators. It is by no means a mass movement within the army. That is an impression that people tried to create after World War II. It is not. It is a minute group, and the only one they have is effectively Stauffenberg. Stief, the man I quoted earlier, is a scrupulous Protestant Prussian officer who thinks, yes, Hitler needs to be done away with, but is not willing to commit the political murder himself. And that is why Stauffenberg has to fly to East Prussia, plant the bomb, get out alive, get back to Berlin. And that is also why all the alert measures that have been prepared beforehand, everything that is to be declenched at the given moment, will only be released, initiated, when Stauffenberg returns from East Prussia in the afternoon of the 20th of July, between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. If we look at what actually happened, one thing comes to mind, and that is that the Nazi regime as such did not have a good day. The Gestapo never prevented the attempt on Hitler's life, and right into the evening, nobody in the system really understands what is going on. For example, yes, they find out Stauffenberg was the man who planted the bomb. So a Gestapo officer is being sent with a driver to Bentler Block to arrest this man, perpetrator. Of course, the conspirators assembled in Bentler Block arrest the Gestapo officer instead. The Gestapo had never hit upon the idea that this might be part of a major uprising. The real size of what is happening becomes clear only between 6, 7, 8 o'clock, both in Berlin and in East Prussia. And even then, the Gestapo is not really doing a good job. So Himmler, who profits from all these events, has an established interest in covering up to a large extent how his security organs had actually failed. And the reports that the Gestapo sends to Hitler about what they found out and how they're uncovering more and more of the conspiracy have to be read in that source critical light as well. Namely, the Gestapo had to cover up their own incompetence during the process. But what it also does is it radicalizes the regime further. During the final phases of war, you have an increasing internal radicalization, and that goes not only against Social Democrats, Communists, as it had for the preceding 11 years, but now the reactionaries come into focus as well. Rotfront und Reaktion is what the Horst Wessel song says. And that also explains what you would know as Operation Gewitter, the arrest of several thousand Weimar period politicians. To come to an end and to come to your questions that I see popping up already, was this just a desperate attempt by a few nationalists trying to avoid the worst for their country once the war that they had supported for so long proved unwinnable? Now, that would be a mistake as well. You cannot reduce the resistance to a set of utilitarian objectives either. I would like to point out one thing. The members of the inner circle of conspirators had all realized that there was no alternative to surrender and to an occupation of the Reich. And even so, Tresco, for example, wrote, although the source basis is a bit wobbly. The assassination must be attempted at all costs. Even if it should not succeed, an attempt to seize power in Berlin must be undertaken. And that is what Tresco also said after the thing had failed, before he committed suicide on 21st of July. In a few hours' time, I shall stand before God and answer for both my actions and the things I failed to do. I think I can, with a clear conscience, stand by all that I have done in the battle against Hitler. Just as God once promised Abraham that he would spare Sodom if only 10 just men could be found in the city, I also have reason to hope that for our sake, he will not destroy Germany. So at a time when most utilitarian considerations had gone down the river, when there was nothing more to be expected, those few still did not give up, as they might well have done. They might well have said, look, there's no point anyway, let's lie low. They didn't. But before we look at all those moral motives that are somewhere behind it all right, we should do for the military conspiracy what has been done for the political dimension of the conspiracy 50, 60 years ago. Namely, we should look at their professional motives. And yes, they knew about their involvement in the crimes. Steve, to quote him again, wrote to his wife, "I can see the coming judgment only as just atonement for the outrages which we Germans have committed or allowed to happen during the last years." For Steve and for many others, it was the knowledge of their own guilt that compelled them to stand up against the man who had made them accomplices of genocide. So some conspirators acted out of political, diplomatic motives. Among the officers, many acted out of professional military motives. But does that detract from the historical role? Is it immoral to do what is morally right out of professional insight? Thank you, and I'm open for questions.
Thank you so much for this fascinating and important talk. And I do recommend all of you to check Professor Heinemann's new book in English. I suggest that now we will move to Yaron Pasher's presentation, and then we can open the floor for a discussion. So Dr. Yaron Pasher is a faculty member at Western Galilee College. He teaches history in the Holocaust Studies program, as well as in the Department of Interdisciplinary Studies and Logistics. Dr. Pasher's field of expertise is in comparative history of the Holocaust and World War II, integrating modern Jewish history, strategic thought, and wartime logistics in the 19th and 20th century. Dr. Pasher was a fellow at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem and has held a fellowship with the Claims Conference for several years. His book, Holocaust versus Wehrmacht, How Hitler's Final Solution Undermines the German War Effort, was published with the University Press of Kansas in 2015. He is currently working on his second book about Albert Ganzenmüller. Dr. Pasher is going to present today on Blaming Hitler, German Generals Explaining the War. Yaron, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Daniela, for these kind words. I'll just share my PowerPoint in a minute. Okay, can you see it?
Yes,
Okay.
we can see it.
All right, thank you. Okay, so, sorry?
תעשה תצוגה מלאה של הפאורפוינט.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, thank you everybody for coming and joining us today. I saw before Professor Dina Porat here. So Dina, hi, Thank you for joining us. Dina is my mentor to the day. So I'm very excited.
Yaron.
Hi, Dina. Shalom. So I'm very
Shalom,
excited
shalom.
that she joined us. So I'll begin my presentation, and Daniela, you have to give me the time when needed, okay? Thank you. So the diaries and memoirs, which were written after the Second World War by German generals who served in the Wehrmacht, are an important source for understanding the events of the Second World War, although they should be dealt with caution and therefore treated critically. The writers of these compositions are likely to use an apologetic flair to their writing whenever they mention their part in the campaigns that allegedly were conducted parallel to the extermination activities and genocide. All try to supply a clean cut of the events, while in most cases one would find inaccuracies regarding the level of awareness of their involvement in connection to war crimes and crimes against humanity that the regime they were part of committed. Scholars, however, like Omer Bartov, Wolfram Wette, Jochen Buhler, and Alexander Rosino had meticulously cataloged the Wehrmacht's war crimes and adherence to National Socialist ideology. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht has been fully exposed by the late 1990s. The debate in recent years concerning these sources, whether testimonies during trial, interviews, or private papers, is that they are unreliable in many accounts. Still, by re-examining these sources with this awareness in mind, one can easily identify that when the writers of these sources detach themselves from the direct events in order to protect their court cases, they do tend to be precise, a pattern that repeated itself during the interrogation of these criminals at Nuremberg and apparently sneaked into their post-war writings. Cross-informational steps, therefore related to the same events from different writers, usually gives the historian a clear picture of what has occurred. The harsh criticism that is, just share again. The harsh criticism that it's being heard of Basil Littlehart in recent decades applies mainly to Littlehart's own attempt to influence the generals to accept his version as though he were the main influence on all the armored warfare in Germany and the inspiration for the German blitzkrieg. The self-serving attitude of the German generals at the end of the war and how their biased or sometimes ignorant or twisted views are no longer taken as truth in academic military literature after Littlehart has given more than enough credit to their perspective or claims, bring the discourse to a new level. A brief example is Karl Dönitz in his memoirs, which overestimated German naval capabilities in U-boat warfare way too much and claims he was not a Nazi, nor was the German Navy Nazified, and they are unaware of the Holocaust. If that was a question, why on earth did Hitler appoint him then as his successor? Another major misleading event was Erich von Manstein's same insistence he had not known nothing about the Holocaust, which bluntly falsifies the truth. It's now widely known and accepted that the memoirs of senior German military figures have to be read with caution. There are a number of reasons why the generals' accounts are so distorted. Implication or association with criminal activity is certainly one. Protecting the good name of the Wehrmacht is another. One has to look at the broader picture of global history in which these memoirs were written, for instance, during the Cold War, when, for various political reasons, historians in the West were keen to accept the generals' own view of their activities. In Nuremberg, for instance, at points they were not threatened and did not fear consequences, they answered quite freely and gave detailed answers. The German historiography related to the war before the reunification of Germany was influenced naturally from the geopolitical situation that was created after the final surrender. The profound impact left by the Nuremberg trials on the German population created an apologetic approach in the German way of writing history, while the Littlehart interviews with the German officers were to a certain extent the designating line. The general's memoirs diaries served as primary material for the first wave of West German writing. In most cases, this was a unilateral history, while the entire blame for the failure of the war was always put on Hitler as an amateur strategist. Only in the beginning of the 1980s, with publication of the MGFA series, an official line of writing was forming shape. Lack of preparation for war in Russia, underestimation of the Soviet power, production ability and Soviet endurance to fight a war of attrition for long that eventually enabled victory over the Nazi regime turned to be the leading and main approach in Germany today. Basil Lilhard was many things, but above all, he was a military historian. He wrote tracts on Sherman, Scipio Africanus, Rommel, and military strategy itself. His work influenced even Neville Chamberlain's way and may have even accidentally influenced the misperception relating to the Wehrmacht's part in the atrocities during the Holocaust. Leonard and Fuller, particularly in the Reichswehr, the Weimar's Republic military force, they were carefully studied and all their articles read. In Germany, only Guderian and von Reichenau fought for the mechanization of warfare. The other high generals before 1939 and the bulk of the general staff faced these revolutionary developments with skepticism, including the then Chief of General Staff, Ludwig Beck. It was a struggle between the antiquated aristocratic soldier of the 19th century and the youthful technician soldier of the emergent modern age. At a time when he was feeling particularly frustrated after the Second World War, Lilhard, understandably, exaggerated the contrast between the neglect of his ideas by British generals and their enthusiastic reception by the Germans. In fact, he had his supporters in the British army, while his influence in Germany was largely due to three pro-Nazi generals, Blomberg, Reichenau, and Guderian, who were all well placed in the 1930s to distribute his ideas. Lilhard's most valuable and distinctive contribution to German military thought were probably made before creation of the 1st Panzer Division, specifically in his concepts of deep strategic penetration by massed armored forces, and his insistence on the need for an infantry component and mechanized supporting arms as distinct from all tank divisions. Finally, Lilhard's post-war claims to have exerted an important influence on German armored developments were essentially due to the acknowledgments of General Heinz Guderian. When Hitler explained to his generals a few days after assuming the chancellorship that his government would crush democracy, pacifism, and Marxism at home, build up a vast military establishment, and then use the new army for the conquest of the Germanization of living space in Eastern Europe, the generals were on the whole not unfavorably impressed. There was not much in Hitler's domestic policies as explained to them, to which the military leaders objected. The idea of rebuilding German military might appeal to them greatly, and they associated the idea of conquering living space in the East with the recapture of lands lost to Poland, together with perhaps such additional parts of Poland as might be obtainable in the next partition of the degenerate country, according to them. According to Gerhard Weinberg, in this alignment of the military leaders with Hitler, there were several miscalculations, mostly on the side of the generals. It would take some of them years to recognize those miscalculations, while the rest never figured them out at all. The first misunderstanding was about the location of the living space, the Lebensraum in the East, that Hitler intended to conquer. While the generals assumed Poland, Hitler wanted such vast stretches that they could only be taken from Russia. With the one war contingency that German military men had been concerned about, a war with Poland temporarily removed from the scene by diplomacy, the buildup of the German armed forces moved forward along lines most of the soldiers favored. There were arguments over the proper speed of expansion, as well as over problems of equipment, personal assignment, and tactical doctrine, but none of this went beyond the usual daily frictions that accompany major change in the size of a military establishment. More severe friction, and friction having a bearing on the contingency of war, would grow out of the conflict over the respective roles of the German army, general staff, and the staff of the war minister and commander-in-chief of the armed forces. When Hitler met the minister of war, the foreign minister, and the chiefs of the three branches of the armed forces on November 5th, 1937, he gave his assessment of the current situation and his plans for the future as far as he cared to reveal them. In this meeting, taken notes by his army adjutant Fritz Hausbach, known later as the Hausbach Memorandum of the Blueprint for War, Germany asserted needed space for its population which could not be fed from its present space. Dependence on world trade would not do it. It limited independence, and no one argued at the meeting with the Führer's long-term aims. With his short-term aims, no one argued either. All the objection dealt with his calculations as to risk involvement. While Hitler watched for opportunities, he met with one on January 1938. The German Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, married a young woman who turned out to have a record of moral offenses. Hitler seized the opportunity to rid himself of a whole series of generals and diplomats and to take over his position of Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces himself. So he got rid also of Ernst von Neurath and Schacht, and while seizing the details of what has come to be known as the Fritz Blomberg crisis need not to be recounted here, but one aspect of it had a most important bearing on the situation of Germany's military leadership, the succession at the top. Almost as soon as von Blomberg's fault was called to Hitler's attention, and before anyone had an opportunity to discuss the matter with him, he decided to dismiss von Blomberg and also to use trumped up charges of homosexuality that he knew to be false to dismiss von Fritsch as commander-in-chief of the army. Now that Hitler felt ready to begin implementing the aggressive policies he intended to pursue, he wanted not just willing instruments, but totally dependent and pliant tools. Hitler's daily contacts with Wilhelm Keitel during the crisis convinced him that here was a man he could depend on. A judgment that correctly assessed an officer would remain in the same position until 1945. On the left, on the right of the screen, you can see von Blomberg, in the middle von Fritsch and Werner von Fritsch, and von Rundenstadt on the left. On the 10th of May, 1940, the phony war came to an end, and when Germany launched its campaign in the West against France and the Low Countries, the origins of Hitler's hot order on the 24th of May, 1940, within 15 miles from the town of Dunkirk, postponed the advance for 48 hours. The issue raised a full unsolved question that remains unanswered. What exactly drove the Führer to give this order remains a puzzle. Different reasons were given by the generals of the post-war memoirs, such as Blumentritt, von Rundstadt, Harliman, and von Bock, in an attempt to explain it. However, by counting them alone, one realizes that there still is no solution to the Second World War mystery. There were approximately 6 different military explanations for the halt order. First, to allow the tank formations to cut down the gaps and redeploy before the final assault. Second, to wait for the infantry units to give cover to the motorized spreads from the French units to the southwest. Thirdly, Hitler never failed, and he had no courage to take a risk for the final showdown. Fourth, the terrain around Dunkirk was unfavorable for panzer movement due to soggy ground. 5, redeployment and lack of serviceable panzers. And 6, Hitler wished to preserve the armored units for future missions. So each general in his post-war writings gives a different explanation for the events of Dunkirk. And all these have been part of the historical discourse for quite a while, all which in some way or another have been proved as incompatible with the test of reality in the battlefield. One explanation that, although aroused skepticism, but could and has never been ruled out, for there is no evidence that this was the case, points to a diplomatic gesture driven by Hitler to the British by allowing their expeditionary force to escape with only small injuries. Several reasons lead to this explanation, as the most probable was that Hitler, for the first time during the Blitz campaigns, interfered with the actual conduct of war and imposed the dilettante military abilities on the Wehrmacht. Churchill's famous victory speech on the 4th of June stating that we shall never surrender, which was perceived as propaganda on the other side of the channel, raises a few questions, and so does the fact that in a very peculiar way, he blames General von Rundstedt, left in the on the screen, for giving the order when it was clearly very clear that von Rundstedt was only delivering a directive from his supreme commander, surely not making decisions on his own. Another question that arises is why there wasn't German attack in the middle of the evacuation. A persistent one would likely put Dover and its surrounding air bases in German hands with only minor losses for the Luftwaffe. In one examination, if one examines the gesture explanation as a probable option, the question is why was Hitler so keen on reaching out for Churchill's hand and sparing the British a humiliating defeat, something he did not spare from the French with the ceremony in Compiègne. At this point, one should take notice of the ideological aspect of the events and the view with the same context. So there's the aspects of the fuel. I don't want to go into it, but there is Madagascar program in the background. But the sequel to the events of Dunkirk is what happens with Operation Sea Lion with the generals. Its blunders are an extension of Dunkirk, and the implication of Dunkirk were that, for one, the British could suffer defeat, and that shipment of troops in a short time across the channel was a feasible task. The first person to internalize these insights, and General Cohen mentioned it before, was General Erhard Milch, Goering's deputy in the Luftwaffe. After seeing the equipment the British left scattered around the beaches of Dunkirk, he suggested an invasion on the 5th of June. Milch's suggestion was ignored along with several others until on July 16, 1940, Hitler put out a reluctant directive for a landing operation to be executed and only if necessary, and conquer the British island only if necessary. 3 days later, on the 19th, in a public address, he offered the British to end hostilities and clashes, which did not really point to a determined path. These offers were rejected by a counter broadcast Lord Halifax delivered, which made things clear that the British would not surrender even if invasion was launched. German general assessed Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, was feasible for several reasons. In the first place, the British Navy deployment did not serve as a threat after Dunkirk. With its tenfold superiority, it couldn't be brought to action. Part of it was at Scotland, another at Liverpool, part of it in Iceland, some of it in the Mediterranean, and part protecting convoys in the Atlantic. Dispute within the military was not over the actual operation, but on the landing area. In any event, Hitler was the one to blame for not taking action. The Balkan campaign of spring 1941 was unique in comparison to the campaigns during the war. In April 1941, Hitler gave more concrete orders to the Army High Command and hardly interfered with the operation deployments or moves, contrary to the campaign in the West. The coup in Yugoslavia on the 26th of March, in which the pro-German government was impeached, forced the Germans to act, for it affected their pre-preparations for Operation Barbarossa. The Balkan campaign presented the German might in its height and was probably their most successful one during the whole war. Hitler ordered in a direct, decisive way to conquer immediately both Greece and Yugoslavia, with emphasis on dismantle of the two countries. As for the performance of this mission, it was left totally for the generals to decide. Yugoslavia and Greece serve an example of an almost ideal situation in respect of the Germans. Hitler made a decisive and immediate political decision, while the army was free of last-minute outbursts of the frills that clashed with the operational program and from his interference in the conduct of the campaign. the German army executed the quickest draw and fired the most efficient shots of the Second World War in Europe. In just 11 days from March 26 to April 6, 1941. Field Marshal Keitel portrayed the success as one of the Army's highest military performances. In his memoirs, which were written during his Nuremberg trial, he remarked that Hitler was so determined with the decision that he didn't even give Ribbentrop a chance for possible dialogue with the Yugoslavs. When victory gave way, Hitler was a hero. The German general's attitude to a different campaign changed along the way, while with the Polish and Western campaigns, they were reluctant to go to war. At the same time, they had a difficult time trying to hide their joy of victory after the French capitulation. In Operation Sea Lion, things turned around with the Führer and his generals. At this point, the generals, were so confident in the German capability to win that in this case, they were the ones that persuaded Hitler to reach a decision to invade Britain while he was showing signs of hesitance and lack of interest. German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June, 1941 did not see objection from the generals and was seen as a legit possible objective from the military point of view, especially after the impressive victory in the Balkans. In order to obtain a swift victory over the Soviet Union, the initial German High Command planned to annihilate the majority of the Soviet forces in a series of encirclements close to the new Polish-Soviet border. The plan presented to Hitler on December 5th, 1940, in regard to the upcoming campaign in Russia, was to concentrate the main forces in the center front. Hitler, of course, made a few changes in his plans. Instead of capturing Moscow, his first priority was to encircle Russian forces before they could retreat deep into the vast territories in the Ukraine and the Caucasus. In order to gain this advantage, the Second Army needed to turn one of its two panzers, Army Group panzers. But the point is that in the initial phase of Operation Barbarossa, there is actually no resistance to the plan. Halder claimed, Franz Halder, chief of the OKH, claimed in July 1940 that from his point of view, a victory over the Soviet Union is simply a matter of a right operative approach. Thus, although the German generals were not convinced at the time in the necessity of a campaign against Russia, and thought that prior to that, British threat should be dealt with on the Western Front before turning towards the East, both Halder and von Brauchitsch believed that an operation such as Barbarossa was feasible in a swift blow. If one examines the counter-operative opinions, Moscow versus Leningrad, the Ukraine, on the 15th of July, it seemed apparent that neither Halder nor Hitler expected to bring the Soviet campaign to a showdown by conquering either of those objectives. The different approaches represented, in fact, hidden ambitions and low-key antagonism. In other words, if Moscow was the aim, the victory would be a military one, including the break of the communist state and the leading paralyzing, and at least paralyzing it. If the Ukraine was conquered, on the other hand, the victory would be a National Socialist one. In any event, as evidence shows, the decision was cardinal only in mid-July. The only operative aim was the annihilation of the Red Army, while the assumption was that the initial blows would pave the way to move forward with the other assignments. In mid-July 1942, after a series of disputes between von Bock and the German High Command, General von Bock, and this is General Franz Halder, this is General Fedor von Bock, commander of Army Group Center in the Soviet Union. After a series of disputes, the former was unsurprisingly replaced by General Field Marshal Maximilian von Weichs as commander of Army Group Center. This change was a result of a direct order from the Führer after von Bock deemed the forced advance of all available forces in the direction of Kamenets-Podolsk demanded by the Army High Command unfeasible because of the road conditions. So this is the logistics part. The fact that the mobility of certain formations, such as the 24th Armored Division, and the mobility of certain formations, such as the 24th Armored Division and the Großdeutschland Infantry Division, was greatly reduced in those days due to fuel shortages, confirmed by von Bock's doubts about the success of the entire pursuit operation, which in view of the enemy's withdrawal, both east and south, he considered fundamentally mistaken in concepts. The first desire to turn the younger generation of officers into his willing tools was finally fulfilled when General Halder was relieved in autumn 1942 from his post as Chief of Staff of the OKH. He referred in his diary to the farewell meeting with Hitler as being extremely tense. "We must part," Adolf said. The message he received from Hitler was that it was necessary to educate the General Staff in fanatical faith in the idea he, Hitler, is determined to enforce his will only onto the army as well. According to Speer, in 1942, criticism of operations practically ceased when Halder left his position as chief of the OKH. The movements of each division was discussed with Hitler personally in a daily conference, and even the most irrelevant details had to be reported. Both Goering and Keitel accepted Hitler's point of view unreservedly. At this point, all aspects of the war, including economic ones, appeared to be run by the Führer's yes men. These naturally were the grounds for Kurt Zeitzel's appointment as Chief of Staff of the OKH, replacing Halder, and Zeitzler, as an inconspicuous officer, advanced to the high position in the army, came surprisingly without resentment. The fact that he was promoted to Brigadier General only on April 1st, 1942, was not held against him, nor did it bother anyone that he was not part of the Army High Command, but it was a field staff officer member with little experience of command in the East. On the contrary, Hitler saw this to be in his favor. The Führer wanted a relatively young, optimistic officer who would be compliant and politically weak, unlike the traditional generals who by right should have been candidates for the position of the Chief of Staff. Ironically, in dismissing Halder, Hitler got rid of one of the most fundamentally optimistic military leaders surrounding him. Even at this relatively late period of the war, Halder was unable to grasp the seriousness of Germany's position. I'd like to go back to where I started, back to Basil Littlehart, and then I'll conclude. In May 1945, as the Second World War was drawing to a close, the British journalist and military writer Basil Littlehart was something of a forgotten figure. At the outbreak of the war in 1939, he had been the leading military commentator in Britain, politically well-connected and influential, and has also established a formidable reputation as a military theorist and historian. However, the rapid defeat of France had discredited his theories, leaving him isolated and with no role in the war effort. But after the end of the war, he managed to establish contact with a group of German generals who found themselves imprisoned in Grisdale Hall in the north of England. And he soon realized that there was a potentially malleable group of individuals who could help him reestablish his reputation as a military authority. The generals themselves also quickly realized that the meetings with Littlehart could be employed for their own purposes, that Littlehart was more than a little opportunistic in the use he made of his contacts with these former Wehrmacht generals had been generally recognized by historians and by his friends. Yet the extent and nature of these contacts has not been discussed in detail, which is possible given the extensive source and material available today. Littlhart's reputation, however, as one who decisively influenced the proponents of armored warfare in Germany during the interwar period, has recently been marred and thrown into question. It has been revealed that this reputation was largely self-propagated, and that to create it, he actually exploited the plight in which the German generals were after the Second World War, and scrupulously manipulating their evidence for his own ends, blaming Hitler for all the blunders during the war. For several years after the war, the German generals were detained, and Littlehart interviewed them. And Their evidence served as the basis for his book, The Other Side of the Hill, or the German General's Talk, as the American edition was called. Out of the deepest conviction and best of motives, Littlehart became one of the leaders of an unpopular public campaign on the German general's behalf. He argued relentlessly that they were no more than honorable and patriotic professional soldiers who had generally kept aloof from politics, had had an instinctive class and caste dislike for the Nazi regime, and had not been involved in the Nazi atrocities. In this respect, he accidentally planted the seeds for future Holocaust deniers such as David Irving and Colin Montagnol. Again, Hitler was the one to blame. And the other side of the hill, he collaborated with the defeated and apologetic generals in developing this influence line of argument, which later historical research would increasingly qualify and reject. He denounced as unjust and vindictive the intention to prosecute the generals as war criminals, acted to improve their prison conditions, and tried to ease their discomfort by personally sending them parcels with small amenities such as food and tobacco. Only by going through his files, which are available for research at the Littlehart Center for Military Archives in King's College, London, in a mere bunch of ego documents, one can get a true measure of the immense time and effort invested in the matter over the years. Okay. I'd like to quote one case of these generals that Littlehart is very acquainted with, and this is von Manstein. By that I will conclude. Littlehart's made efforts did not bear fruit, despite the fact that the Field Marshal was heavily in his debt. I'm speaking of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. Littlehart intervened to relieve the hardship and humiliation which Manstein endured in the prisoner of war camp. And on Manstein's request, he even arranged for his wife and child to be transferred to his sister's house in the French zone occupation in Germany. He campaigned against Manstein being tried as a war criminal, assisted in his defense when he was put on trial, and fought for his release after he had been convinced. He took under his care the publication of the English edition of Manstein's war memoirs, Lost Victories, and as late as the 1960s intervened to secure a place at Cambridge for Manstein's son. Yet despite Manstein's gratitude, he withstood Littlehart's indirect attempts through Manstein's lawyer to, in biographer, to make Littlehart the inspiration behind the Ardennes operation, which Manstein conceived and which had led to the Allies' collapse in the West in 1940. Finally, when manufactured evidence, such as the one Littlehart produced after the war, is revealed, the damage to one's case might be fatal. Littlehart's claim for influence on the Germans had lost its credibility in the eyes of historians. Some even went far as calling him a liar. At the very least, it had come to clear that he exaggerated this influence at the expense of Fullo and other British armor pioneers. At the same time, not only his case, but British influence as a whole on the evolution of the German Panzer arm, which previously was taken for granted, has now been called into question. And yet, Littlehart's self-inflicting injury in trying to write the historical record himself does not close the case, but merely opens it afresh. The fact that he was fraudulent does not necessarily mean that he was wholly incorrect. And that goes also for the German generals in general. To establish how things really were, the evidence on the subject from the German sources of the interwar period itself must be looked into. Thank you, and I'm open to questions now.
Okay, I will already have 4 questions, at least. I will give a summary of the questions, and then we'll give the two speakers a chance to reply, and we do want at least a 10-minute break. So this has to be on a brief discussion for this time. There is a break, but we need that. I think that was the plan. Okay, so we have questions on for Professor Heinemann. One from Edward Westermann is about the part of the senior Wehrmacht leadership in the decimation of millions of Russian POWs. Does this play, when they reflect over the war and make their decisions, does their own behavior towards vis-a-vis the prisoners come into play? Or only what they did to the Jews, if at all, or to the occupied people? Again, Leonard Rein says that we can't say that the German generals were surprised about the aims of the war, about the way the war in the Soviet Union was becoming a murderous war, because they heard it very early from Hitler that this is what is going to happen. So their shock at what happened to the German army and to us is a bit artificial, so it seems, says Leonid. For Yaron, we have Edward Westermann again. We have this change from all the generals who Hitler throws out quite early and the young technical generation. Can we see this changed as explaining the fact that the German generals in the East, at least, were far better in tactical decisions, operational successes, but not in strategic thinking? And I think this is a criticism we hear also about Fall Blau, that they were good tactically, but they didn't listen to Hitler's strategic thought, which was much better than theirs. And again, we have Daniel Giola is asking about Yaron, about the fact that the Wehrmacht is murderous very early, even before reaching the USSR. We already see the behavior of the Wehrmacht in Poland, in the Balkans. So what is the role for commanders in this? Do we see this as something that is against military policy that changes when going to the Soviet Union? Or actually, are these generals okay with this when it happens in Poland or earlier, even in France, even before they go to the Soviet Union? And I will stop here with the questions. I'm sorry if I miss, we will give these two questions to the two speakers. Professor Heinemann will be first, and then Yaron Pasher.
Well, I'll try and be brief. Eduard Westermann's question after the Soviet prisoners of war. Among the conspirators, you have the whole panoply. You have, of course, Eduard Wagner on the one hand, who commits suicide after the failed attempt, who probably would have been hanged for his role in treating Soviet prisoners of war after 1945, had he survived. He's the quartermaster general, and his orders are those that say, well, most of them will sadly have to starve. That's it. On the other hand, you have Stauffenberg himself, who is responsible within Army High Command organizational branch for establishing what eventually becomes the Vlasov Army. And Stauffenberg, as I said, comes on his mother's side from a family of old Baltic nobility. His uncle, his mother's brother, Uxkul von Güllenband, is one of those who actually helped set up those Fremdvölkische Verbände, those formations created out of Slavs, Turkish, Turkmenis, whatever, prisoners of war. So you have both this concept of let's use their anti-Bolshevik attitude for our own benefit, and you have let's starve them all to death. So here too, you have a wide panoply of attitudes. To Leonid Rein's question, yes, Hitler speaks on 3rd of February, we know that, but he says a lot of things. He says similar things, of course. The Hossbach memorandum, Yaron mentioned that. He does say all sorts of things, but then, yes, that is exactly the problem. He says you can read lots of things into Mein Kampf, some of which came to materialize and many of which never did. I would warn against the two teleological interpretation. And then the other point I would make is the resistance that culminates in the 20th of July plot is not a resistance of the generals, it's certainly not of the senior officers. It is a resistance of the colonels. Even the few generals involved, most of them have only been promoted a year or two before. So it is the second level of the command. It's not those that were privy to Hitler's speeches in February 33 or in 1938 or whatever. So Hitler has this broad approach that allows many people to contact with his ideas. And that's the one thing. You can interpret a lot into Hitler's speeches. Second is, the officers I'm talking about, many of them would never have really known what Hitler said to the senior generals.
Thank you. Yaron, please.
Okay, so first to Edward Westerman's question. You know, this is, you're asking about Clausewitz. Did they come from the old Clausewitz school? Well, I think what happens is that they come from the Clausewitz school, but when the campaign in the East goes further and further, they are thinking in the Jomanist school of thought. Antoine Jomini, the inventor of logistics, the Napoleon thinker. If they are part of the failure, if the young generals are part of the failure, this is a hard question. You know, you can, evidence shows that Hitler was much more innovative than they were. Hitler had a very good intuition where things are going. In other words, if you look at the debate in the 15th of July, 1941, Moscow versus the Caucasus and Leningrad. So he's way more innovative than they are. He understands fuel, he understands food supply. They're in the political sense of capturing Moscow. So I think when these generals are, you know, retired, go to early retirement, and I'm talking about Halder and von Bock, possibly we see a change in strategy, but again, it's very hard to say. For Daniela Gioia's question, I think this is a question for Professor Browning, but I'll try to answer it anyway. We know that in the Polish campaign, right after the Polish campaign, the atrocities around the Lublin reservation plan are brought to a halt because they need approximately 100 kilometers, a radius of 100 kilometers for the army units. And you know, if I think the Balkan campaign is very unique in its fast and very successive outcome, because there isn't any ideology influenced in there or then involved there. I mean, nobody is involved in ideology because they are looking to the east. And the Balkan campaign, the coup d'etat in April 1941, is something unpredictable. There's no ideology there. Therefore, the campaign is very, very unique in its outcome. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, we will stop here. We promised a break. We will meet again in 10 minutes at 8 p.m. Israel time, which is much earlier somewhere else. 10 minutes from now. So we are now going on break.
Thank you.